Well, I think it's important. I mean, I think the way our levels kind of go, like when we're talking about, for instance, like the move from prelim to intermediate, it can be even lower. Like what you're asked in the dressage test and some of the questions throughout in the cross country, they lead you to the next level. So it's not just about, like Karen said, it's not just about getting it done and getting it through that. Going into what Philip said as well is, is the horse really understanding these questions? Like you can you see people kind of blow through the training level coffin, you can kind of whip on through it a little bit. Is that really, are we seeing the correct preparation, the correct coffin canter for that'll put you on to the next level? So it's not only, being able to answer the questions, but, with your trainer, is your trainer really seeing that you understand what's needed to prepare, and is the horse understanding the various questions? And I think even with certain things like ditches, we want to make sure our horses are understanding the questions that are being asked of them, and they're doing it because they understand it and they want to, not because it's like, gotta get to the other side, and that's what we're talking about, the adrenaline thing, where the horses are working off that and maybe not really thinking about the questions and being thoughtful about it. I do feel like you have to almost feel a little, sometimes maybe a little bored at the level. You've done all the questions, you really understand it, and that's something you can't necessarily decide oftentimes on your own. You need an ongoing relationship and discussion with your trainer for that. So hopefully that answers the question.
There's two things I would say to that. First is there seems to be in many places a misconception that it's about winning. In other words, I've heard people say, well, I've got to win 3 events. I'm going to make myself win 3 events at this level before I move up. It's not just about winning. There's some horses that may never actually win an event. I mean, they may be good horses and they may be advanced horses ultimately, but they're, for whatever reason, in the dressage. So I always base, my advice to people pretty much based on their cross-country abilities, because the dressage for all of us, every one of us, is an ongoing process. And when people put this, in other words, there are times where people want to move up too fast, as Karen pointed out, but there's also times where people need to move up and they're thinking to themselves, I'm not good enough, I don't win enough. And actually they ride quite well. And so I always encourage people to really look at, their proficiency, as Philip was talking about, on the cross country, because that's really what the sport's about. Everything else sort of comes around that, the flat work and so forth. And sometimes the move up will promote you to do more than a 20-meter circle, and we'll start to get you to do a little bit more. The other thing I would add is that, and I think that's a problem in our country that we're trying to address, but there are some levels that are easier to move up to than others. In other words, it's a little easier to move up from novice to training than it is to go from training to preliminary. To me, that's the hardest gap, and I think we have a little, even if you look at just the dimensions of the jump, you're looking at 2 inches, 2 inches, and then going from training, then there's 4 inches. So, and then from preliminary to intermediates, 2 inches and 2 inches to advanced. So we almost have a gap level there, and that, I think, is something that we have to address as a sport, and it's been talked about, but we need to get that, because I think that's where a lot of people maybe they're doing very well at the training level, but the questions, as Philip was saying, are pretty simple, and then all of a sudden you go into the preliminary and they're quite difficult. And so you have to be, in particular at the training level, you need to be quite good at that and really kind of working ahead in your training while you're still at the training level, but already starting to work on all those questions. Because if you just go one weekend training level and say, well, that was easy, and you just enter the preliminary event, there's a lot of preparation, in particular for the preliminary level and preliminary rider doing it for the first time, that has to be taken care of.
I think something else too that people have to understand in this sport, it's okay to be where you are happy. I think sometimes feel the pressure, whether from a friend or someone else who is moving up, and we all have to move up, we all have to go on, but it's good to be where you are comfortable. Not everyone, or not every horse, even though you might have you might have the ability and get there to be a preliminary rider or have a preliminary horse, it's okay. You should hang out and be where you're most comfortable, enjoy the sport in the way you really want to and your horse really wants to. And so that's a big part of your horsemanship as well. And again, an ongoing conversation. I mean, I have students that feel like, I got to move up, I got to do this, I got to do, and it's almost like, you kind of have to have the conversation. Is that what you really want? Or you feel like you're supposed to want that? So it's another part of it. I know that's not totally the question, but it's something to think about as well.
Well,
I mean, I think one of the first things I look at when somebody maybe asks me a question whether or not they're ready to move up is just how well balanced the rider is. I mean, I think when you're talking about moving up, obviously, building on what Mike and Allison have said, you want to see how proficient somebody is at handling the types of questions that they're going to see at the competition. But you're also talking about bigger jumps, bigger drops into water, probably more terrain, more technical things, and the rider's ability to stay in balance with their horse, not just maybe for when things are going perfect, but when things don't go perfect, because our sport is not a game of perfect. Stuff goes wrong. And the rider has to be, I think, balanced enough and secure enough to be able to handle those types of kind of situations. So the rider's balance is probably the first thing I look at, especially when they're asking a question whether or not they're ready to move up to a higher level.